So how did your family react when they saw you were drifting away?
Yeah, I mean, they've always been very supportive of everything I do, especially intellectually. So there's never been really any animosity. I wouldn't even necessarily say it's a drifting away. We've always continued to have really good conversations about ideas. So they've been nothing but supportive.
Mhm. Okay, now going to your work. When I attended my first IHS seminar, you gave a lecture on public choice. What is the school of thought and how does it apply in 2014?
Yes, sure. So public choice, actually, in the kind of grand scheme of economics, is relatively new. It got started in the early 1960s, and it's basically just applies some of the most fundamental tenets of economics, things like people responding to incentives and being self-interested, and just turns them away from the marketplace and actually applies them to the public sector, to the way politicians and bureaucrats behave. And once you go down that road, once you kind of embrace this idea that, as radical as it might be, the idea that politicians are people too, and respond and are self-interested and respond to incentives. Once you go down that road and kind of start looking at politics through that lens, you get some pretty good explanations for some of the inefficiencies that we observe in the public sector. It's still extremely applicable to today as it was back in the 1960s when it was first kind of as pursued as a line of research. I mean, if you look just at any of the growing bureaucracies that we have in the healthcare sector and elsewhere, these can all essentially be explained by public choice kind of ideas.
Except for healthcare, with the 2014 electoral campaign almost to an end, what are some issues that could be applied to public choices?
Really anything. I mean, if you look at just we have political we have a series of political ads that are going on here, like I believe they are across the U.S. anyway. And it's just really fascinating to watch how people try to market themselves to get votes, and they do so in a way it's intentionally vague as far as specifics on ideas, but is attempting to be provocative. So we have down here in Alabama, one of the major issues, of course, is demonstrating that you're a pro Second Amendment candidate. So we have a lot of ads where
I
we have
remember.
yeah. So but even now we still have ads where politicians are displaying their guns very prominently because they want to demonstrate to voters who are just getting their information basically from 30-second spot on a television ad. They want to demonstrate that that's an idea that they take very seriously. So basically, the idea that voters are not going to become very informed because they realize this is something we call rational ignorance. Voters don't take the time to get fully informed. Instead, they go to the voting booth and they either vote for a candidate that they found particularly memorable or even just a political party. You see this as when politicians actually go to campaign. They try to get the good soundbite or get the funny political ad because they know that voters don't really have time or interest in getting the full kind of nuances of any of the particular issues.
If electoral campaigns are just about marketing yourself, is it bad or is just something that happens?
I mean, I think that it's something that's a good question, and it's something that we need to kind of we need to focus on. Probably the question that comes before that, which is what do we actually want to get out of our electoral system? If the idea is that we want people to be more informed or take more time to get informed when they're making political decisions, then yes, you could probably look at this as bad. The fact that people don't take time to get informed before they go vote, and that can be remedied by things such as ensuring that people's votes actually count more by trying to limit the number of people that vote or something like this. If the idea is that we just want more people to vote, which is something that's very popular down here. We hear talk about not enough people turning out to vote. I've heard predictions for these midterm elections that are coming up being on order of like 10% of voters will turn out to vote. If the idea is that we want more people to vote, then with that comes this idea that each individual vote becomes less meaningful. So we would not necessarily expect people to be taking the time to get informed. So it really just boils down to what you actually want out of your democratic process. The nice thing about a public choice approach is that it doesn't necessarily hold democracy up as like anything sacred. It's a way to organize preferences. And public choice just lets us say, if you want democracy, which has a lot of lovely features, But if you want democracy, there are going to be certain types of problems, and this rational ignorance one is one of them.
Still about politics, one of your newest papers makes a connection between public choice and South Park. How do you make such a seemingly strange connection?
Right. So there's the show South Park. It's been on for, I think it's 17 seasons now. And for my money, it's actually the best economics that's on television, which as silly as that might seem to people, because it's intentionally provocative, it's intentionally raunchy at times. But as far as the actual
of killing Kenny.
Right. So there's the paper that you're referencing. There was actually a specific issue. There was a specific episode where the students of the elementary school are forced to vote for a new mascot, and they're given two very unorthodox candidates. And the whole episode basically boils down to, given that we have to vote between these two candidates, neither one of which we actually like, is there actually a point to voting? And at the end of the episode, you find out that one of the main characters, Stan, he chooses to abstain from voting, and his parents and everybody else is just shocked that he would take such a cavalier attitude towards the voting process. And he finally comes back and he votes, and he turns out that the candidate he picks ends up losing in a landslide, 1,000 and something to like 15. And he makes the claim, well, you see, my vote didn't matter. And so, I mean, that's just one instance. It's not just public choice. You can actually apply. There's a lot of really good economics in South Park. And I think that, I personally use it in my own teaching. Intentionally provocative because it gets students excited about it. I mean, you've seen me in action at an IHS seminar. I do the same thing there, and because people don't expect it to see economics in that fashion. And it's just that South Park's the vehicle I choose to use. The nice thing about economics and the real beauty of economics is that since it's so universally applicable, you can kind of find examples of it in pretty much anything.
One of your other papers is entitled "The Need for Constitutional Constraints on Government." Which government are you talking about, and isn't the actual Constitution enough to constrain the government?
Yeah, so that is actually that's actually a paper I wrote for a policy book that my center here in Alabama we're putting out in the state that basically looks at the state of Alabama in particular. And so the paper that I wrote, it makes the argument that constitutional constraints are necessary, which is something that's not new. I mean, a lot of people obviously are aware of this. We hold our national constitution here in very high esteem. But what a lot of people don't realize is that each one of our 50 states here in the U.S. Has its own constitution. Each state has its own constitution. And Alabama's is unfortunately not the greatest. Alabama's constitution is something on order of 400,000 words long. It's the longest written constitution in the world. If you take the English translation of any national constitution, only India's even comes close, and it's not. It's still only about half as long. And Alabama's constitution is just extremely specific. We have constitutional centralization of power, basically, so that individual local communities basically have to go get constitutional amendments to hire local services. The example I use in the paper is something like Limestone County, which is a county in Alabama, had to get a constitutional amendment to hire somebody to pick up dead farm animals. These are obviously very pure local issues. Many of them go out onto the ballot every November and have voters. I live in Pike County, and presumably if I were here when that amendment were proposed, I would have been able to vote on whether Limestone County, which is a county I've never been to, could hire somebody. There's constitutional amendments on the salaries paid to judges in individual counties. There was just recently one on the waterworks in, I believe it was Mobile. So these are this is not what you would expect from a constitution by any other standard. So what that paper basically tries to set out is set the stage for why we need constitutions, makes a lot of these public choice arguments we've already talked about. We need a constitution to basically constrain government officials because men aren't angels. And but just having the Constitution is not in and of itself enough. The Constitution has to be designed in a way that makes sense, and Alabama's, unfortunately, is not.
Are there other states with such constitutionalism?
Yeah, so there's a wide variety of approaches to the constitutional project, and if you just look at the length of constitutions, which is a pretty good barometer of how specific they are, Alabama's, again, is clearly the longest, but other states, I believe California has a very long one. I believe Texas actually has a very long one. And then you look at states like Rhode Island, which basically has an extremely short and condensed constitution. So the degree of centralization of power in the Constitution. Normally, we think, of course, for the U.S. Constitution, we think of the Constitution as basically constraining the central government. Whereas, at least here in Alabama, we have a constitution that actually almost explicitly empowers the central government, which is a very different kind of document.
Very strange. Still on the topic of government, one of your paper talks about fiscal decentralization taming the Leviathan. Does it? Are federations more spendthrifts than centralized countries like France?
Yeah. So basically, this all follows from an argument made by, it falls out of the work of James Buchanan, one of the founding scholars of public choice. And it's this idea that as you take government services and you basically devolve them, you put them at the lowest level of government. So instead of having stuff decided by a national centralized board, you basically allow certain, at least local services, to be carried out by those local governments. When you do that, it basically allows for individual voter residents to choose between communities. It's much easier for me to move from Troy, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama. It would be for me to move from the state of Alabama to the state of Georgia, or even to move out of the U.S. to Canada. It's very difficult to move as you get up to these larger units. What this allows then is if we actually have these services and different types of tax structures or different types of legal regimes, if we have this experimentation at the lower level, it allows voters to basically vote with their feet, to use the popular expression, and pick and choose communities based on these services. The natural byproduct of that then is that the governments themselves, who are seeking to keep their residents in town and their business investment in town for tax revenue or other types of purposes, given that voters are going to be able to pick and choose communities, the governments themselves end up competing with one another. And in general, what we would expect to see then is a constraining effect on government. And we do tend to see this in the data. The more decentralized a country or a state is, the more decentralized, the more constrained the level of spending or the growth in spending tends to be.
When you finished your paper, what was the state of competition between local communities in the U.S. or at least in Alabama?
So the different it clearly varies across states, and so in Alabama we actually have, as getting back to the Constitution, we actually do not have a large degree of this decentralization, specifically because so much of it has to go through the state legislature. Another state that I've looked at in the past is Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania does actually have quite a great deal of decentralization and competition amongst its local communities. But yeah, I mean, it varies widely across the states as far as how decentralized you see the fiscal environment.
On the national level, fiscal competition seems to still be a hot topic with so-called fiscal havens. How does it affect U.S. politics, and do they even care about international competition?
Well, this is something that certainly is, it's always in the news, but it seems to be in the news even more now. We just famously had about as American a company as you can imagine, Burger King, is planning on moving up to the Great White North, and they bought up Tim Hortons and I guess it basically in a very thinly veiled guise to move their location up there and get more favorable tax treatment. You see this with other companies, and it certainly is a concern, especially because in the U.S. here we have a $17 trillion national debt. So tax revenue fleeing, for lack of a better word, is clearly a bad thing. My position on that, though, is it differs from some of the people in the government, as you might expect. Where we have, our President Obama famously has talked about an idea of economic patriotism and the idea that companies should actually be paying their fair share.
He's not the first one.
Right, and this is kind of a claim you hear, this idea that this is somehow unpatriotic for companies to be leaving, and you hear that our Treasury Department here has been enacting kind of emergency rules to try to curb this. My point of view on this is a bit different in that it seems that if you have a if you have the need for the Treasury Department and the president to be coming out and trying to fix the various loopholes in the tax code that allow companies to basically move abroad and get more favorable tax treatment, rather than trying to continually fix the holes just to have the companies come in and circumvent the new rules, it would seem that a simplifying of the tax code, just throwing out a lot of these loopholes in the first place and lowering the rates. We have some of the highest tax rates, corporate tax rates in the world here in the U.S. Yeah, and if you lower the rates and get rid of some of these loopholes, it makes these moves to different countries doesn't make them make as much sense. Companies like Burger King should really be focusing on creating jobs, making products and services that people value, and not investing so much of its time and resources into figuring out, how can we best rig the system so that we can pay the lowest in taxes. I don't think that if you ask the people at Burger King what they want to be spending their time doing, it should be trying to navigate our tax code. So that's my kind of take on that is, it's certainly a major issue. I don't think the solution that we're currently undertaking here as a country is necessarily the best one.
You're talking about fiscal reforms. I'm not very familiar with it, but could you make a comparison on how Reagan reformed the tax code and how it might help or not the U.S. in 2014?
Yeah, so I mean, in that particular era, one of the main things was a cutting of certain rates. I think that the more fundamental issue we have here is just it's overly complicated. Our tax code is overly complicated here, and this is the corporate tax code, but it's also the personal income tax code. And so you'll hear calls for a flat tax or certain politicians even, but a lot of economists will talk about at the personal income tax level it should be as easy as filling out about a tax form the size of a postcard instead of the mountains of paperwork that are involved in filing our taxes now. All of these talks of companies and the rich avoiding taxes, we famously have Warren Buffett talking about paying less than his secretary. All of these talks could really be avoided if we just simplified the tax code. Said if you're making, you can have some kind of basic deduction like we currently have here in the U.S., and then beyond that, whatever your income is, just tax at some flat rate. This could be applied to personal income, but also corporations, and get rid of a lot of these loopholes and special exemptions that take place, because that's where a lot of the trouble lies in. And it means companies and individuals like myself, it takes me a good couple days to do my taxes, and I'm not somebody making a ridiculous amount of money or involved in a lot of different types of transactions, but it's taking me considerable amount of time to do my taxes. So you can only imagine once you get up to the corporate level and how complicated their tax code is. That's really the issue, is how complicated our tax code is.
But considering the public choice approach, would reforming taxes be even feasible?
Right. So herein lies the issue, right? Is that with the complicated tax code, we have a extremely large bureaucracy. The most visible part of that here in the U.S. is the IRS. But even when you just want to think about the entire industry built on tax accountants, people that make their living due to a very complicated tax code, that people go and get an accountant just because the tax code is complicated. Presumably, you wouldn't have to do that if it were more simple. So there's a lot of institutional kind of features, a lot of entrenched interest, if you want to call them that mean reform along these lines it would be difficult. And unfortunately, because of these entrenched interests, it would almost you would expect some kind of like shock to the system. Similar to a financial crisis like we just got through, where people really start talking about, wait a second, this is clearly failing, and I don't necessarily see that in the immediate future. So while you're exactly right, it's very easy to talk about reform and what a better system would look like. Actually operationalizing that, due to a lot of these public choice and bureaucracy kind of issues, is going to be much more difficult.
Mm-hmm. Any final thoughts?
No, I mean, I think that I would certainly encourage your viewers to go out and read some of, not even necessarily my work, but just read some stuff about public choice and get informed about some of these arguments about applying the economic way of thinking to the public sector. Because I really think it really opens some eyes, at least it has with my students, to the way the world works, as it were. And I think it's truly powerful way of thinking.
Well, George Crowley, thanks for being with us. For those who still haven't joined Liberty.me yet, you can do it and save $5 a month on your subscription by entering the code BASTIAT-SAY. I hope to see you all there eventually, and may Liberty be with you.